The year was 1941, and Adolf Hitler stood at the pinnacle of his power, drunk on the victories that had swept across Europe like wildfire. But behind the Iron Curtain of the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin was plotting something far more sinister than Hitler could have ever imagined. What began as a war of ideologies would transform into the most brutal personal vendetta in human history, culminating in the complete annihilation of Berlin and the systematic destruction of everything Hitler held sacred. Hitler had always viewed Stalin with contempt, but it wasn't until their secret diplomatic meetings in 1939 that the true depth of his disgust became apparent. During the negotiations for the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, Hitler privately referred to Stalin as nothing more than a Georgian butcher who had clawed his way to power through rivers of innocent blood. These words, whispered in the marble halls of the Reich Chancellery, would eventually reach Stalin's ears through his vast network of spies, and they would burn in his memory like acid. The German dictator saw Stalin as a crude peasant playing at being a world leader, a man who had murdered millions of his own people through forced collectivization and purges that made even the Nazis seem restrained in comparison. Hitler believed that the Soviet Union was nothing more than a house of cards, held together by terror and incompetence, ready to collapse at the first serious blow. He was convinced that Stalin's butchery had so weakened the Red Army that Germany would steamroll through Russia in a matter of weeks. But Hitler had made a fatal miscalculation. He had confused Stalin's brutality with weakness, not understanding that the Georgian's willingness to sacrifice millions of his own people wasn't a sign of incompetence, but rather the mark of a man who would stop at absolutely nothing to achieve his goals. While Hitler played at being a military strategist, Stalin had been hardened by decades of political warfare that made the Western Front seem like a gentleman's duel. When Operation Barbarossa launched on June 22, 1941, it seemed as though Hitler's assessment had been correct. German forces smashed through Soviet defenses like a sledgehammer through glass, capturing hundreds of thousands of prisoners and racing toward Moscow at breakneck speed. In Berlin, Nazi propaganda ministers worked overtime to paint Stalin as a coward who had fled the capital, leaving his people to die. Hitler personally approved radio broadcasts that mocked Stalin as a butcher who couldn't even butcher the German war machine. These taunts reached Stalin as he worked 18-hour days in his underground bunker, coordinating the desperate defense of his empire. Foreign diplomats reported seeing the Soviet leader's face turn ashen with rage when German radio broadcasts were played for him, particularly when Hitler's voice came through the static, dripping with contempt as he described the Soviet leader as a backwards butcher who had finally met his match. But Stalin wasn't just angry, he was calculating. Every insult, every humiliation, every German victory was being carefully catalogued in his mind. He began keeping a personal record of Hitler's taunts, writing them down in his own hand and storing them in a locked drawer of his desk. His closest aides noticed that he would sometimes take out these papers late at night, reading them over and over again. His jaw clenched so tight that veins bulged in his forehead. The turning point came during the Battle of Moscow in December 1941. As German forces ground to a halt in the frozen suburbs of the Soviet capital, Stalin made a decision that would haunt Hitler for the rest of his life. Instead of simply repelling the German advance, Stalin chose to launch a counteroffensive so brutal and comprehensive that it would serve as a preview of what he planned to do to Berlin itself. The Soviet winter offensive didn't just push back the Germans. It annihilated entire divisions with a savagery that shocked even hardened Wehrmacht veterans. Stalin had given specific orders that no prisoners were to be taken in certain sectors, and German soldiers found themselves facing an enemy that seemed more like a force of nature than a conventional army. The Red Army troops had been told that they were fighting against men who had called their beloved leader a butcher. and they responded with a bloodlust that defied comprehension. Hitler watched in horror as his supposedly invincible Wehrmacht was not just defeated, but humiliated in ways that defied his understanding of modern warfare. Entire German units simply vanished overnight, their positions overrun by Soviet forces that seemed to materialize out of the frozen landscape like vengeful ghosts. The Führer began to realize that he had awakened something in Stalin that went far beyond conventional military strategy. Stalin's revenge was just beginning. As the war turned against Germany, the Soviet leader began implementing a strategy that went far beyond military necessity. Every German city that fell to the Red Army was to be treated not as a conquest, but as a personal settlement of accounts. Stalin had transcended the normal bounds of warfare and entered into something that resembled a blood feud more than a military campaign. The evidence of Stalin's personal vendetta became clear during the Battle of Stalingrad. The city bore Stalin's own name, and when Hitler ordered his forces to take it at any cost, the Soviet leader saw it as the ultimate personal insult. Stalin reportedly told his generals that Hitler's attack on his namesake city was like spitting in his face, and that the response would be proportional to the insult. The destruction of the German Sixth Army at Stalingrad wasn't just a military victory, it was a carefully orchestrated piece of psychological warfare aimed directly at Hitler himself. Stalin made sure that German radio operators could still transmit right up until the final moments of the battle, ensuring that Hitler would hear the death throes of his once proud army. The Soviet leader wanted his German counterpart to listen to every scream, every plea for help that would never come. But Stalingrad was just the appetizer. As the Red Army began its inexorable march toward Berlin, Stalin implemented what he privately called the Butcher's Bill, a systematic plan to make Hitler pay for every insult, every humiliation, every moment of contempt that had been heaped upon the Soviet Union. Soviet forces were given explicit orders that differed dramatically from sector to sector, with some units told to take prisoners and others instructed to show no mercy whatsoever. Stalin had studied Hitler's psychology extensively, and he understood that the German leader's greatest weakness was his need to be seen as a great conqueror in the mold of Napoleon or Alexander. The Soviet strategy was designed not just to defeat the Wehrmacht, but to strip away every shred of Hitler's self-image as a military genius. Every German defeat was to be as humiliating as possible, designed to eat away at the Nazi leader's sanity like acid. The Battle of Berlin began on April 16, 1945, but Stalin's personal war against Hitler had been raging for years by that point. The Soviet leader had spent countless hours studying maps of the German capital, not as a military target, but as the physical embodiment of everything he wanted to destroy. Berlin represented Hitler's dreams of a 1,000-year Reich, and Stalin was determined to turn those dreams into the most spectacular nightmare in human history. The Red Army that approached Berlin in 1945 was unlike any military force the world had ever seen. These weren't just soldiers seeking victory. They were the instruments of Stalin's personal vengeance, fueled by years of rage and a burning desire to settle accounts with the man who had dared to call their leader a butcher. Soviet troops had been subjected to months of intensive political education that painted their mission not as military necessity, but as a sacred duty to avenge every insult that Hitler had heaped upon their motherland. Stalin personally reviewed the battle plans for Berlin, making modifications that had nothing to do with military efficiency and everything to do with maximizing the psychological impact on Hitler. The Soviet leader wanted the German capital to burn, but he wanted it to burn in a way that would drive Hitler insane with rage and despair. The attack was timed and coordinated not just to capture the city, but to destroy it so thoroughly that future generations would struggle to believe that such a place had ever existed. The first shells that fell on Berlin carried messages that Stalin had personally composed. propaganda leaflets that contained excerpts from Hitler's own speeches, calling the Soviet leader a butcher. These leaflets rained down on the German capital like snow, covering the streets with reminders of every taunt, every insult, every moment of contempt that Hitler had shown toward the Soviet Union. Stalin wanted Hitler to know that this wasn't just military conquest, it was personal revenge on a scale that defied comprehension. As Soviet forces fought their way through the streets of Berlin, they encountered resistance that was as much psychological as it was military. German defenders found themselves facing an enemy that seemed to take personal satisfaction in the destruction they were wreaking. Soviet soldiers who laughed as they fired their weapons and seemed to derive genuine pleasure from watching German civilians flee in terror. The systematic destruction of Berlin was unlike anything seen in the war up to that point. Soviet forces didn't just capture buildings, they obliterated them. Entire city blocks were reduced to rubble not because of military necessity, but because Stalin had given specific orders that Hitler's capital was to be erased from the face of the earth. The Soviet leader wanted to ensure that when the war ended, there would be nothing left of Berlin that Hitler could recognize. Stalin's attention to detail in the destruction of Berlin bordered on the obsessive. He personally approved target lists that included not just military installations, but cultural sites, government buildings, and residential areas that had no strategic value whatsoever. The Soviet leader wanted to strip away every symbol of Nazi power, every monument to Hitler's regime, every building that might serve as a reminder of the Third Reich's former glory. The bombardment of Berlin reached its crescendo in the final weeks of April 1945. As Stalin unleashed the full fury of the Red Army's artillery on the German capital. Soviet gunners had been given specific instructions to target not just military positions, but any structure that might have personal significance to Hitler. The Reich Chancellery, the bunker where Hitler was hiding, the government buildings where Nazi officials had planned their campaigns of conquest. All were subjected to round-the-clock bombardment that turned them into smoking ruins. But Stalin wasn't content with just physical destruction. He wanted to break Hitler's spirit as thoroughly as his armies had been broken on the Eastern Front. Soviet radio broadcasts penetrated the ruins of Berlin, carrying messages that Stalin had personally written for the German leader. These weren't typical propaganda broadcasts, but personal taunts designed to drive Hitler to the brink of madness. The Soviet leader's messages to Hitler during the final days of the war revealed the depth of his personal hatred for the German dictator. Stalin reminded Hitler of every boastful prediction, every confident assertion that the Soviet Union would collapse within weeks. He quoted Hitler's own words back to him, describing in vivid detail how the butcher had systematically dismantled the Wehrmacht and was now in the process of erasing the Third Reich from history. Stalin's psychological warfare reached its peak on April 30th, 1945, the day Hitler chose to end his own life in his Berlin bunker. Soviet intelligence had intercepted German radio transmissions indicating that Hitler was considering suicide, and Stalin personally composed what would be his final message to his defeated enemy. The message was simple but devastating in its effectiveness. The butcher sends his regards. The fall of Berlin represented more than just military victory for Stalin. It was the completion of a personal vendetta that had consumed him for years. The Soviet leader had methodically dismantled everything that Hitler held dear, reducing the 1,000-year Reich to rubble and ash in less than 4 years. But even Hitler's death wasn't enough to satisfy Stalin's thirst for revenge. Stalin's treatment of captured German officials revealed the personal nature of his war against the Nazi regime. Unlike other Allied leaders who were content with military victory, Stalin demanded that every Nazi leader who fell into Soviet hands be subjected to interrogation, sessions where they were forced to acknowledge that their Führer had been wrong to dismiss the Soviet Union as weak and Stalin as a mere butcher. The Soviet occupation of Berlin in the months following Hitler's death was designed not just as military administration, but as a continuing humiliation of everything the Nazi regime had represented. Stalin personally approved policies that turned Berlin into a wasteland, ensuring that the former Nazi capital would serve as a permanent reminder of what happened to those who dared to challenge the Soviet Union. The destruction of Berlin's cultural institutions was particularly systematic and personal. Stalin had compiled lists of museums, libraries, universities, and artistic centers that represented the intellectual foundations of German civilization. These institutions weren't just occupied or converted to Soviet use, they were methodically stripped of their contents and then demolished. Stalin wanted to ensure that future generations of Germans would grow up in a cultural wasteland, unable to take pride in their heritage or draw inspiration from their past. The Soviet treatment of German civilians in Berlin reflected Stalin's belief that an entire people needed to be punished for their support of Hitler's regime. Unlike the relatively restrained behavior of American and British forces in their sectors, Soviet troops were given wide latitude in their treatment of German civilians, with many units interpreting their orders as license for revenge against anyone who had supported the Nazi regime. Stalin's personal involvement in the administration of occupied Berlin extended to the smallest details of daily life. He approved ration policies that kept German civilians on the brink of starvation, housing assignments that forced former Nazi supporters to live in bombed-out ruins, and work details that required German professionals to perform manual labor under Soviet supervision. Every aspect of life in Soviet-occupied Berlin was designed to serve as a constant reminder of German defeat and Soviet victory. The psychological impact of Berlin's destruction on Hitler during his final days cannot be overstated. German radio operators in the bunker provided regular reports on the progress of Soviet forces through the city, and Hitler's aides reported that the Führer became increasingly agitated as familiar landmarks were obliterated one by one. The man who had once dismissed Stalin as a Georgian butcher was forced to listen helplessly as his capital city was systematically erased from the map. Stalin's revenge against Hitler extended even beyond the grave. After Hitler's suicide, Soviet forces spent weeks searching through the ruins of Berlin for any trace of the Führer's remains, not out of respect or curiosity, but because Stalin wanted to ensure that there would be no Nazi shrine to commemorate their fallen leader. The Soviet leader was determined that Hitler would not only die in defeat, but that his memory would be obliterated as thoroughly as his capital city. The complete destruction of Berlin served multiple purposes for Stalin. It was simultaneously military necessity, political statement, and personal revenge. The Soviet leader had transformed what could have been a conventional military occupation into a comprehensive dismantling of everything that Hitler had built or dreamed of building. Berlin wasn't just captured, it was erased, turned from the capital of a mighty empire into a wasteland that bore no resemblance to its former glory. The international reaction to Stalin's treatment of Berlin revealed the extent to which the Soviet leader had transcended normal military objectives in pursuit of personal revenge. Allied diplomats reported being shocked by the systematic nature of the destruction, noting that Soviet forces seemed more interested in obliterating German civilization than in securing military victory. British and American observers described Berlin as looking less like a conquered city than like the site of a natural disaster. Stalin's personal satisfaction with the destruction of Berlin was evident in his behavior during victory celebrations in Moscow. Unlike his typical reserved demeanor, the Soviet leader appeared genuinely jubilant as reports arrived describing the complete devastation of the German capital. Witnesses reported seeing Stalin smile for the first time in years as he read intelligence reports detailing the extent of the damage inflicted on Hitler's former stronghold. The systematic nature of Berlin's destruction became clear only in the months following the war's end. Soviet engineering units had been given specific instructions to demolish not just military installations, but any building or monument that might serve as a rallying point for future German nationalism. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble, not because of battle damage, but because of deliberate post-war demolition ordered personally by Stalin. The Soviet leader's attention to detail in the destruction of Berlin extended to cultural and educational institutions that had no military significance whatsoever. Libraries were burned, museums were looted and then demolished, universities were closed and their buildings torn down. Stalin wanted to ensure that the intellectual foundation of German society was as thoroughly destroyed as its military and political structures. The treatment of Berlin's civilian population during the Soviet occupation reflected Stalin's belief that the entire German people bore responsibility for Hitler's crimes. Unlike other occupied territories, where Soviet forces eventually established normal administrative procedures, Berlin was subjected to policies that seemed designed more for punishment than governance. German civilians were forced to live in conditions that bordered on the medieval, with limited access to food, fuel, or medical care. Stalin's psychological warfare against the German people continued long after Hitler's death. Soviet propaganda broadcasts in German reminded listeners daily of their former leaders' arrogant predictions about Soviet weakness and Stalin's supposed incompetence. These broadcasts featured recordings of Hitler's own voice making boastful claims about German superiority, followed by graphic descriptions of Berlin's current condition. The personal nature of Stalin's war against Hitler became evident in the Soviet leader's treatment of captured Nazi documents and artifacts. Instead of simply confiscating them for intelligence purposes, Stalin ordered that Hitler's personal belongings be subjected to public ridicule and destruction. The Führer's uniforms were displayed in Moscow as trophies of Soviet victory, while his personal papers were read aloud on Soviet radio as examples of German delusion and incompetence. The reconstruction of Berlin under Soviet occupation was deliberately designed to erase any trace of the city's Nazi past. Streets were renamed, monuments were demolished, and entire districts were redesigned to eliminate any architectural reminder of the Third Reich. Stalin wanted to ensure that future visitors to Berlin would find no evidence that the city had ever served as the capital of Hitler's empire. The international implications of Stalin's personal war against Hitler extended far beyond the borders of Germany. Allied leaders who had initially welcomed Soviet participation in the war against Nazi Germany began to question whether Stalin's methods represented liberation or conquest. The systematic destruction of Berlin served as a preview of Soviet intentions throughout Eastern Europe, where similar policies of cultural destruction and population displacement would be implemented in the coming years. Stalin's treatment of German prisoners of war captured during the Battle of Berlin revealed the personal nature of his vendetta against Hitler's regime. Unlike other Allied powers who established prisoner of war camps with basic humanitarian standards, Stalin ordered that captured German soldiers be subjected to intensive political education designed to force them to repudiate their former loyalty to Hitler and acknowledge Soviet superiority. The psychological impact of Berlin's destruction on the German population extended far beyond the city's borders. Germans throughout the country received reports of the systematic devastation of their capital, creating a sense of national trauma that would persist for generations. Stalin had succeeded in his goal of breaking German morale so thoroughly that resistance to Soviet occupation became virtually impossible. The Soviet leader's personal satisfaction with the outcome of his war against Hitler was evident in his private communications with other Allied leaders. In previously classified diplomatic correspondence, Stalin made numerous references to Hitler's former arrogance and the poetic justice of the Third Reich's complete destruction. The Georgian butcher had proven that brutality, when properly applied, could indeed triumph over military genius. The legacy of Stalin's personal war against Hitler extended far beyond the immediate military victory. The complete destruction of Berlin served as a template for Soviet behavior throughout Eastern Europe, where similar policies of systematic cultural destruction would be implemented in Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and other occupied territories. Stalin had demonstrated that military conquest could be combined with cultural annihilation to achieve total victory over an enemy. The final irony of Hitler's humiliation at Stalin's hands was that the German leader's own assessment of his opponent had been completely backward. Hitler had dismissed Stalin as a crude butcher who lacked the sophistication to wage modern warfare. But it was precisely Stalin's willingness to embrace brutality on an unprecedented scale that had made him unstoppable. The Georgian peasant had outmaneuvered the Austrian corporal at every turn, turning Hitler's own tactics against him with devastating effectiveness. The ruins of Berlin stood as a permanent monument to Stalin's victory over Hitler, but they also served as a warning to anyone who might dare to challenge Soviet power in the future. The complete destruction of the German capital demonstrated that Stalin was willing to go to any lengths to achieve his objectives, regardless of the human cost or international opinion. The man Hitler had dismissed as a butcher had proven that sometimes the most brutal approach is also the most effective.